Okay, welcome everyone. We're slowly gonna start so that we can use the time that we have. I'm Jelke Wosten at King's College London. I run gender studies at King's, and I'm really pleased to introduce to you Dr. Eglė Česnulytė today. Eglė is a lecturer in politics and international development at the University of Bristol, and she's also the deputy director of the Gender Research Centre at Bristol. Now, Eglė has done long-term field work and ethnography amongst sex workers in Mombasa and Nairobi. I think that must have been 2010, 2011, 2012, around that time, while she was a PhD student in Leeds. And in the meantime, she's worked really hard, has published several papers in journal articles and started new projects and so on as academic life goes. But now, just last year, I think, or in late 2019 or early 2020, this wonderful book came out, which is based on that original field work, plus additional field work, which you still have done afterwards, I think, Eglė, on sex workers in Mombasa. Now, time has passed, it seems ages ago, but once I was your supervisor, Eglė, and I can't be more proud than having someone who actually publishes this fantastic book with Cambridge University Press called Selling Sex in Kenya, Gendered Agency under Neoliberalism. And I really look forward to hear you speak about this now. So everyone who's here, welcome. We have this is a Zoom seminar set up. So there is below on your screen a Q&A function. So if you have questions along the way or afterwards, then please pop your question in the Q&A and we can read them out and ask your questions. So please do that while you listen. Eglė will talk for about 30 minutes, I think, and then we have plenty of time for Q&A. We run until 2 p.m. And then we'll have to stop. So Eglė, without further ado, I give the stage to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jelke, for having me. It's really nice to speak about my book because it came out almost a year ago, and with all the pandemics and everything, it kind of disappeared somewhere. So it's nice to come back and to speak about my actual research and to, introduce you to my work of quite a few years now. So I will share a screen. I have some slides. I cannot share the screen and slides. Can this be changed or should I go without slides?
Well, let me try this.
Oh, wait, I think I can now.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Great.
So what is my book about and what will I do in this session? So in general, in my research, I'm interested in exploring how gender functions in broader social, political, and economic structures. And this book is doing exactly that. This book is exploring how gender functions in the larger social, political, and economic structures that were affected by neoliberalism. And what does it mean for women? So like, how do those structures determine the limits of agency or boundaries of agency, right? And I'm doing in this book that through the particular case study of women who sell sex in Kenya, and in particular in Mombasa, but also, like in my research, I spoke to quite a few women who work in Nairobi. I'm doing that for several reasons. So first, like very often when we think about gender and the neoliberalism, we are drawing on examples that center around formal economy and the formal spaces. and the experiences of people who are in the informal sphere, or like in the spheres that are beyond the whole formality, are very often neglected. And for that reason, I'm starting in the global south with women who are selling sex and therefore are in this informal sector, but also like on beyond certain formal structures into society more generally, to make most sense of what is going on here when it comes to gender and neoliberalism. So for that reason, the key three themes in the book are gender, neoliberalism, and of course Kenya, the Kenyan context, because that context is very important to understand what is going on. I'm happy to speak a little bit more about how I understand neoliberalism in questions and answers. But the important thing in my book, I think, and this is something that is, like probably most unique here, is that in this book, I'm trying not to write about sex workers, but I'm trying to write with them. So during my field research, I was collecting life stories of women who self-identified as sex workers. And it is these conversations and, like about their lives and the collection of their journey that are at the very center of the whole research in the book. Right? So like this would be, like the core of the data that I'm drawing on. But of course, I spoke to a lot of other people there. So people in civil society and academics and people working in government structures. Because my research was using quite a few ethnographic methods, I attended quite a few events. So I attended quite a few events for sex workers, organized by the health agencies, or like also events that are organized by sex workers and their associations themselves, as well as a lot of informal, like situations because of the way that field work unfolded. So like I was visiting them in their home, or like meeting them in Mombasa. Mombasa sounds big, but it's actually not that big. It's very easy to bump into one another on an everyday basis. So during my main period of field work, I spent 8 months in Kenya, living and collecting the data. But since then, I've been back several times. And after my PhD, I had another project that was looking particularly at the politics of sex worker movement. And it is this part of the book that I will be speaking about more in this presentation today. So a little bit more about the structure of the book. So the structure of the book, in addition to introduction and conclusion, the first 2 chapters are looking into how gender functions in neoliberal Kenya. Right, so it is thinking about how women are both included and excluded in the new social, economic, and political structures that come about after the structural adjustment period. And I'm in particular interested in, this is what the chapter 3 is about the gendered livelihoods and making the living or surviving, and how how all those, like situations are affected both by neoliberalism, but also, like by this bargaining with patriarchy, as Denis Candioti put very nicely. The following 4 chapters are very much focusing on sex work and the example of sex industries, and it is asking broader questions about how individuals in sex industries are maneuvering and navigating the different structures that are presented for them in the society, how inequalities that are influenced by neoliberalism are experienced, but also reproduced or challenged by women who sell sex. And interestingly, to what extent people have to internalize some neoliberal ideas in order to progress or to make the most out of their situations. So the final conclusions of the book are probably not as drastic. The conclusions are speaking about the fact that it is possible for individuals to benefit from neoliberal system if they are instrumental and if they position themselves in some particular ways. And therefore, thinking about women who sell sex in particular, we see that some of them manage to change their initial precarious position, for example. However, all that is done in a ways that are very much in line with both gendered norms broadly, but also with pre-existing and or, like existing inequalities in the societies. And therefore, while we see some agency that is totally possible for anyone in the neoliberal society. That is the agency that does not challenge the broader structures as such, and therefore it is quite limited in its nature. So today I will speak about something that is actually one of the last chapters before the conclusion, and this will be only part of a chapter. The chapter is looking at how sex workers are connected to the global and national structures. And in this particular presentation, I cannot cover everything, so I will do just a little bit. And that little bit is about how sex workers organize politically, how they make their politics, and how they interact both with the state, but also the international arena. Right, so like this is a little bit more, you know, like a political bit of the chapter. So the starting point for me here is this very particular way that sex worker movement is positioned in Kenya. One could even say that this is paradoxical, because on one hand, we see that sex worker organizations like Bar Hostesses Empowerment and Support Program, whose pictures I'm using here and whose representatives you can see on the left side, the picture, you know, the representatives are sitting in one of the conferences on HIV and AIDS that is being organized in Nairobi. So like on one hand, we see that some sex worker organizations are very much present in the public life of Kenya, and they are engaging with Kenyan state quite successfully. So you will find representatives of sex worker movement sitting on the National AIDS Control Council, for example, or being consulted by the major organizations that are dealing with HIV and AIDS. Yet at the same time, we see that sex workers and their organizations are routinely neglected and encounter state through violence. So on the picture on the right, you can see sex workers who are protesting against police violence and neglect in 2016. And this particular protest is coming after series of serial killers who were targeting sex workers in Kenya in different places. And the fact that police was neglecting those investigations and not following through. So, you know, like on one hand, we see that sex workers are successfully engaging on the state. On the other hand, we see that the story, you know, like is not that optimistic, because like everywhere else, they are definitely neglected and not engaged with more broadly. So I was trying to make sense of this and think about it by using certain concepts. And I think that thinking together with Thandika Mkandawire and his concept of dual accountability, which is linked to, you know, the concept of Jean-Francois Bayard and this extraversion strategies might be helping us a little bit. So for those of you who are not familiar with African politics scholarship, I will just introduce those very quickly. So Bayard theorized that African political elites and African countries more broadly very often use the unequal global power relations and their disadvantageous position in those international relations for their own advantages. Right, so like they would be saying that, you know, like African states have this capacity to constantly extrovert, so to go into the international arena, and then using their disadvantageous position, you know, like instrumentalize it in a way that allows them to maintain power at home. And while Bayard was speaking mainly about political elites, scholars who came after, they expanded this notion, and they're saying that this is not only political elites, but social movements, for example, can use exactly the same strategies, and that this unequal positioning internationally that African societies or countries experience can be instrumentalized by different actors. So this notion will be, you know, like important for me to make sense of sex worker movement today. Thandika Mkandawire was speaking more about politics and politics of aid, and he was pointing out that because of the important role that international aid plays in many African countries, there is a problem of dual accountability that can be observed. So that some African countries, or you know, like in some cases, African countries might be might have to respond to the two sovereigns. So the first would be their own citizens who elected them and for whom they should be working. But because of this dependency on the international aid, they also are equally at the same time, they need to be, responding to the international sovereign. And that would be the citizens of the states that are giving aid to different countries. So my question here is, where are the women in all the story? And are these concepts helpful when trying to understand this inconsistent position that Kenyan sex workers occupy when trying to engage with Kenyan state? And also, can we make this about gender? Are these international processes and the fact that, countries have this dual responsibility, like what do they mean for gender more broadly? So this is the theoretical little bit of today's talk. So let's turn to sex workers and sex worker organization in Kenya, and let's see how they evolved and how they fit with all of this story. So sex worker organizing, of course, is nothing new, and there are records of people who were selling sex during colonial period, at least, organizing in different capacities. The interesting thing is that before the HIV and AIDS crisis, sex workers, or people selling sex, were never organized on the basis of their work as sex workers. They were always organizing because of other issues. So, for example, in colonial Nairobi, you would see that women were going into the national affiliations and associations, so that to ease their transfer of money back to their original homes. Or a lot of prostitutes in Nairobi were also landladies, because they invested their savings into real estate, and they were organizing as landladies in order to respond to some particular issues that landladies would experience in that period. And things started changing with the arrival of HIV and AIDS pandemics, and not only pandemics itself, but also especially the response to pandemics internationally. So with the arrival of pandemics, I have some activists who have been active in the sex worker activism in Kenya since the 90s. They keep telling stories about what a scary time 80s and 90s were, because Kenyan state did not recognize HIV and AIDS as pandemics at that point. A lot of women were dying in large numbers, and it was a very scary time. So people started coming together on those bases, like for support and trying to share the information about, all these rumors about what HIV and AIDS is and how to protect yourselves. However, things started changing even more when after declaring of a national emergency in 1999, suddenly we started seeing a lot of international NGOs and donors arriving to the country. And there were a lot of consequences of all this process, from very negative, sex workers being positioned as a vector of disease and being targeted in these particular ways that furthered their stigmatization and made their lives more complicated. But it also gave an opportunity through this emerging new infrastructure on the ground for people selling sex to come together and to share their experiences of stigmatization, experiences of difficulties of accessing, for example, healthcare and other things, violence. So these opportunities very often came with testing, with treatment facilities, and they were, part of a larger HIV and AIDS response in Kenya and in other places. And it is in this context that we have to think about contemporary sex worker movements, I would argue. So the catalyst for all this was the SWET conference in Cape Town in 2009. So SWET is the oldest sex work organization in South Africa, and they organized a massive conference for people who are selling sex all across the continent. And as one attendee of the conference told me, not even all sex workers present in the conference identified as sex workers at the time. They were just people going to the conference. Right, so at this period, this is more linked to HIV and AIDS, and different discussions that are going around. But what happens in this conference is that people who are selling sex in many different contexts come together, they start seeing commonalities of their issues, and they see that the issues are the same in Kenya, South Africa, or Nigeria. And it is out of this conference that African Sex Workers Alliance is born. So that is the continent-wide alliance that is uniting a lot of sex work organizations all across. Out of all this process, the first national network that is born is the Kenyan Sex Worker Alliance that was established in 2010 by several activists who attended the conference, came back home, and made links with pre-existing sex work organizations, both formal and informal. Right, so like we see that, you know, like this movement is kind of facilitated by the large effort of respond to HIV and AIDS. And we see that Kenyan Sex Worker Alliance, you know, like it is an organization that is following a very similar political agenda like many international or national sex work organizations. So the focus here is on sex worker rights, recognition as workers, fighting discrimination, going for decriminalization, and very much working with capacity building and making life easier for people who sell sex in African context. So when thinking about Kenyan Sex Workers Alliance, or KESWA, we see that this is a movement that is very diverse. So if you look at the movement today, you will see that in just 10 years, they unite massive amount of different groups. So they work both with formal and informal organizations that unite sex workers. They have male sex workers, female sex workers, trans sex workers in cities, sex workers in very rural areas. Their definition of sex work is very broad. So I spoke to people who are working in bars, to people who are independent operators, to strip dancers, and many other different forms of sex work. So there, you know, like if you take the academic definition of sex work, this organization is definitely using that one. And the first coordinator of the movement, what she did is that she applied for some funding, got a research assistant, and went on a very long trip visiting a lot of those formal and informal groups, and to hear what are the needs of people who are in the movement and what can KESWA do for them. And the things that you see on the slide, violence, discriminatory laws, health needs, stigma, and discrimination are the key areas that members of this, you know, like alliance pointed out as the most salient and the most important, and that they identified as something that KESWA should need to address. Now, if KESWA wants to address things like violence, police violence in particular, discriminatory laws, health needs, stigma, and discrimination, there is no way around it. KESWA has to engage with Kenyan state. Right, so like this is where it becomes important for them to be in the conversation with the state, because there is no way that one can deal with those challenges without being in conversation with the state. And this is where, you know, like I think that story becomes interesting, and things that Bayar and Kandawiri theorize about become important. So looking at the story at how sex workers engage with the state, we see that there are some important successes and also some fabulous misfortunes in that attempt. So first of all, we see that their engagement with state in the health sector in particular is really, you know, like strong. You saw sex workers participating in the conference on the first slide, and but you know, like you will see the representatives of sex workers being anywhere where people are speaking about health, or there are discussions about, you know, like HIV and AIDS, for example. And that is very much linked to the way that National AIDS Control Council was established, and the ways that it was linked to the World Bank multi-country AIDS program requirements. Right, so like when the Kenyan state recognized HIV and AIDS as an issue, it immediately went into this partnership with World Bank's program that provided funding for fighting HIV and AIDS. And therefore, from that moment, you know, like if we are using Tandikam Kandawira's idea, it started having two sovereigns in this area. So here, you know, like the Kenyan state was definitely using this international position that it had in order to strengthen its bases at home, because people would be getting healthcare and care more broadly. But at the same time, because this was a World Bank's money, they had to agree to certain conditions. For example, large amount of the funds to be distributed through civil society organizations. And then, of course, gender considerations had to be part of all that story, right? So like we see that in this particular area, in the healthcare, the Kenyan state is behaving in a way that is compliant with international, democratic, liberal norms that include gender. And therefore, you know, suddenly there is some space for sex workers to engage with them. So if you look at any major bodies that are making decisions about HIV and AIDS in Kenya, you probably will meet several of the faces of people who are representatives of sex worker movement, because they are consulting the UN, the UNAIDS agencies, the different kind of agencies on the ground. However, even here, the story is not as frictionless as, you know, like I would like it to be. And there are a lot of tensions. So for example, you know, like once I attended a training that was organized by National AIDS Control Council, and that was targeting what is identified as key populations, so sex workers, intravenous drug users, and men having sex with men, and the police officers. And there they were promoting the human rights responsive law enforcement. Right, so like that would be a massive event with representatives of all the key populations groups and the police representatives. And the conference was opened with a sentence of, the reason you are here is because of HIV. And then after that, there were a lot of cautionings about tolerance and limits of the tolerance, with the police AIDS control unit representative going on to say that, you know, sex work is a crime against the law, and that dignity is important as well, right? So like there are a lot of contradictions going on there as well. And my argument here would be that it is because of the different areas of state being exposed to the international arena in a different ways. So if we are looking at the unsuccessful attempts of sex worker movement to engage with the state, we see that in the areas where the state is not extraverting, or where the state does not have this dual accountability, the efforts to make a change and to make some space for sex worker movement in the state are much, much more difficult. Right, so like there was an episode with Mayor Aladwa of Nairobi in 2012, who just before the elections met sex workers representatives, and after a chat promised them to revise the bylaws of Nairobi and maybe to start a red zone in Nairobi, so that sex workers are not harassed and can be safer when they're working. But just, you know, like in 2 hours after the announcement was made, he made complete U-turn on that position because of a massive backlash in the society, and came out saying there are laws to be followed, no prostitution, no gayism, everything remains the same, do your business outside of town. So this is just one of example, but sex worker activists keep telling more and more of those examples in the areas where the state is not extraverting, and there any attempts to have a productive conversation, be it with political figures at the town level, or, you know, like at the province level, or at the national level, are becoming more and more complicated. So I was really interested at some point to think like, so what happens? And, you know, like how sex workers go about and making their politics in this context where they are allowed just that much space. And that space being mainly the healthcare. And sex workers are very realistic people, and they know very well why they are more successful in the area of health and less successful when it comes to police. And the strategy that they have is also very interesting, and I think very telling about all these international processes. So what sex worker coordinator in 2016 told me, she said, like, we do not like to rough the waters, and their strategy is not to rely on direct confrontation with Kenyan state, and to focus more on the soft means and trying to do something quite differently. And I found that what they are doing is actually very similar to what a lot of informal worker movements are doing globally. So if we are thinking about people, the rubbish pickers in India, for example, organizing, they would be having very similar methods here. So a lot of emphasis is put on information spread and on constructing sex workers as workers and introducing new language to be used in public arena. So Kenyan sex workers every year in December organize their march to commemorate the day to end violence against sex workers on the 17th of December. The first year when they organized it, they thought that this will be an event where maybe several hundred people would turn up, and it ended up being a massive event of 2,000 people. And because this was a first event, immediately it went on all the radio stations, TV stations, and the sex worker activists got a lot of exposure. And that gave them space to keep speaking their agenda and explaining what they are doing here. And this is definitely a strategy that they keep using. They're using a lot of media, and they're saying that this helps for several reasons. First, it helps the movement to create this clear identity where different groups of sex workers, be it rural or urban or trans or male or female or whatever sex workers, where they can relate to one idea of a sex worker. They say that, like these activities allow them to challenge the language that might be unacceptable for them. So they were, for example, very happy to report that because of their constant interviews, now when media writes about them, they use the concept of sex worker instead of prostitute, and they thought that this is something that is definitely positive. But they also use this to point society, media, and probably, to politicize certain movements by numbers. So by now, for example, in 10 years, when this march happens, it happens not only in Nairobi, it happens in at least 10 different cities across Kenya. When there are some injustices that they want to address. So for example, like after those all serial killers targeting sex workers, they are very quickly communicating on different technologies and media, and they organize different protests with similar message from different parts of the cities. So here again, you have a coordinator of sex worker movement pointing out that if we shout in one place, they will not hear us. If somebody shouts from another place, they will not hear them. But if we get shouting from different places, then people will know that this is a serious situation. And so in the context where sex workers cannot engage directly with the state, when they're using all of this soft power to make sure that they are still in a public discourse and that they are still, like there, even if not considered necessarily by the state. So the second prong of a strategy that is also very interesting is that when looking at the governance structure of sex worker movement, we see that it is very democratic and very participatory in its nature. And that it is, it's really interesting to see how much attention is being paid to make sure that messages traveling all the way down and up, and how it actually complies with, all of the different ways that, democratic social movements, for example, are organizing. There is a lot of emphasis on training on human rights and capacity building, which is also very instrumental because people in different parts of the country now are collecting evidence and documenting evidence that sex workers hope to be using in the strategic litigation in the future, right? So like this very democratized system is actually, it has several different aims, but it is very important for sex worker movement to maintain the accountability, transparency, and internalize democratic norms, which, when you look at that line, it sounds like something from the book of conditionalities attached from the World Bank, right? So it is interesting that the movement is internalizing the norms that are not necessarily called for, but it is also very strategic instrumentalization, and it is very strategic because of the third prong of a strategy that the sex worker movement has in Kenya. And the movement activists are very clear that, trying to speak to state actors or different, parts of Kenyan state outside of the healthcare probably will not bring them very far. So what they are doing by internalizing those, like democratic norms, they're making themselves a good partner for big international actors, such as UN different agencies, for example. And their plan here is basically to jump the state and all of this hierarchy and go directly to the international arena, where they are hoping that their alliances with these powerful actors in the international sphere will help them to achieve their national strategy because of the pressure from above, right? So like the aims are very much national, but the strategy is very international. So what we are seeing here, in essence, the Kenyan sex worker movement is also extraverting, just as the state is extraverting. And it is definitely building on the fact that, like through the international aid and through all those international mechanisms, countries might have two sovereigns, and that, when thinking about gender agenda, this having of two different sovereigns becomes very important part of the story. So I will conclude now very quickly. So thinking about how Kenyan sex worker movement is making its politics, I think that, like we have to think about it through this dual accountability and extraversion, because that's one very good way to understand why in Kenya we see the situation where sex worker movement is visible in some areas and completely ignored, or, like even targeted in a negative ways in other areas, and engagement with state is possible in the areas where the state is extraverting and accountable to international sovereign. In other areas that becomes much more difficult. And then if we are looking at Kenyan Sex Workers Alliance and its strategies, we see that its international agenda, well, its political agenda is pushed through very internationalized means. So they are maintaining very strong presence nationally, even though nobody is engaging with them when it comes to the state. And they are focusing on strengthening international alliances that they hope will help them to eventually change national situation. So I'll stop here.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Eglė. Let's see, there we go. Excellent. This is so interesting, and particularly because when we think about sex workers in the Global South, in Kenya, we wouldn't first think about political organization. So I'm actually quite pleased that you presented this chapter, because it's the less obvious story, isn't it? And it's really impressive how well organized they are and how strategic they are, which is really very interesting. Audience people out there, please do write your questions. I don't think we can ask you to stick your hand up and speak just because the way this is set up, but please write your questions in the Q&A or in the chat, and we'll read them out. Please do. In the meantime, I thought what I was curious about, Eglė, is that sort of I had the feeling, but maybe I'm wrong, that there is a period between the 1980s when they organize around HIV and post 2009 when they become more politicized, that there's a period of very large engagement from the aid community, from international cooperation, in that period, particularly in the late 1990s and the early 2000s. And I was wondering to what extent the international aid practices and discourses contribute or challenge the more stigmatizing discourses with regard to sex work in general.
Well, I think that, like the whole story of HIV and AIDS industry engaging with sex workers has many different phases. And I think that the international community became more sensitive and started thinking about questions with time. So like, I think that the first attempts were definitely, like more problematic than what is going on now. And the sex workers probably are, like aware of all of that. And, but in my interviews, I was just interested of what women do with all those organizations and how bothered they are about these problematic portrayals of them, or, practices that has potential to stigmatize. And I was really struck by how instrumental people are in making their choices and how they might engage with organizations whose discourses they might not necessarily like if they can get some benefits out of that.
Yes. Yeah.
Right, so there would be people who would attend all the different kinds of organizations that are targeting sex workers, regardless of how they view them, in order to make their livelihoods easier. Right, so maybe in some places, there is support for the children education. In other places, maybe they get paid for attending certain screenings. In the third place, maybe there is a support group. And these organizations among themselves might think that, each of them is problematic in a different way. But for the person selling sex, it is not necessarily a problem because they are thinking that, okay, here I will get my child's school fees, and here I will get 200 shillings because, they pay for my travel, so that will pay his lunch. And here I will get something else. So I think that for me, that was the interesting bit about how, the things that sometimes we are overthinking are not necessarily as important, or not always as important on the ground.
But it's interesting because it's not only instrumental, it's also strategic, because they clearly have, while they do that in a relatively instrumental manner, they're taking notes in sort of, mental notes in sort of how can I use certain strategies, how, what kind of discourses are appreciated, what discourses put my problem on the map, or which in those later strategies. That's really interesting.
Definitely, and how they present themselves as well.
Yeah.
In some organizations, they would come and say oh, I'm a sex worker, so I'm here to.
Yeah. Fantastic. Great. So we have a couple of questions. Sophie Harman, professor of politics at Queen Mary, says, thank you so much, Eglė. How does Keswa deal with extroverted backlash, i.e. the NAC losing power in Kenyan health sector, backlash from those in the sex work community who reject Keswa's transnational elite networks? She also would like to know when the book is out in paperback.
Thank you, Sophie. Very good questions. So I have to, be clear that the book came out last year, and the last conversation I had with Keswa was several years ago. So I would not be the most up to date now, but they definitely are very careful in their maneuvering all those different kind of backlash. Right. So when it comes to different donors, changing, for example, their policies about things and how we present themselves. And it is really very much calculating exercise. So for instance, during USA, in the past, how many years now, we're not engaging with organizations that are working with sex workers, for example, right? And then sex workers would still try to arrange the meetings with them. And they would be going through different, parts of the movement. So some of the organizations that are part of sex worker movement are not necessarily registered as sex worker organization, because they might have been registered before the movement came about, or because of a strategic choice, for example. So they might be organizations that are registered on paper as working with key populations, or organizations that are working in HIV and AIDS response. And so a lot of them, when they are making choices about how to present themselves to different donors, or how to present themselves in the public sphere, they might emphasize or de-emphasize their being part of sex worker movement. So bar hostesses, for example, might present itself as sex worker organization in some cases, but might downplay that bit and speak about their clinics that are helping people to screen people for HIV and AIDS, for example. And I found that really interesting, that, there is this clear, selection of what kind of, things to emphasize in their engagement and disengagement. And I don't know if that answers the question. I was trying to see where your question is, but it disappeared. So
it disappeared. My fault.
Yeah.
I'm afraid we'll have to do it, or Sophie will have to write another one. If
in the answered tab, if you click on the Q&A thing, it should be under answered.
Oh yeah, it does.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah. Yeah, and then the sex worker community that might reject Kesva's transnational elite networks. This is a very good question. I, of course, like because of the way that I was doing my research, and especially in the latest years, because I'm speaking through the sex worker activists, I do not necessarily have contacts in the community that would be rejecting them. I know a lot of people in Mombasa who have never heard of them. And who might be feeling that they are removed because they are speaking to their local contact who is connected to the local organization and who is connected to the network themselves. So they might not necessarily make the link directly to these, like elite sex worker activists. So that is an interesting place also to think about how the everyday, like person selling sex, how it connects to the sex worker agenda. But I actually have not encountered people who would, refuse to engage with them.
Great. Thank you, Eglė. Hannah Ketola, who's a researcher with us at King's, is thanking you for the interesting talk. She would be interested to hear a little bit more about your reflections on how you conceptualize agency. Are there modalities of agency that go beyond the strategic? Would internalizing the international norms go beyond the strategic aspects that you so interesting outlined? I'm sure you have something to say about that, Eglė. I also really like the phrase making politics. Could you speak a little bit more about how you understand that conceptualization? Very good questions, Hannah. I'll keep it on so that you
Thank you.
Question.
Yeah, it helps. So for me, agency is capacity to make your choices and to have choices that are not limited by the larger structures, right? So like the agency here would be, like to push for what you want regardless of the norms or the structures that try to limit that. So, like in this particular chapter and here, like I'm speaking about activists, so the agency is slightly different, and here the agency would be, like about trying to achieve a national by engaging with international, I guess. But then as well, like here I would have the same question: to what extent that is challenging the broader structures, and to what extent that is not following the certain patterns that are set in place already. And maybe that agency is also possible only to the extent as long as you are following the internationally accepted way as activism should be made, for example, or, like how sex worker organization should look like. So these are interesting questions to ask. And for me, like in my book, the key focuses on not on women who are in this high politics of sex worker activism, but more, like people who are just selling sex in Mombasa. And there the agency looks, like in many different ways. So people who are putting themselves through education in order to get formal jobs, people who are accumulating enough capital to go into the lines of businesses that are traditionally associated with male jobs, for example, transport business, or things that are, like locally gendered as very male activities and are more profitable at the same time. So for me, I think that these are the interesting examples of agency that, like breaks away from the gender norms, breaks away from the local structures, and allows women to achieve something that, like they want to. And making politics like this is born out of the questions that my students keep asking about how to define politics, because very often people have this very narrow understanding of politics. And for me, making politics is something that helps us to achieve our common aims and move together in the strategic, tactic ways. So, like you don't have to be a politician to be involved in politics in Kenya. And I think that especially in places where women are so excluded from the formal political sphere, you can still make politics without being part of all that story. And so that is why I'm speaking about making politics in this probably different way. So like still being very political, pushing for political aims, but not necessarily through the formal or traditional political engagement mechanisms. I hope that answers the question.
That's a very nice answer. It's very interesting. It's really the social movements, no? So do you fit this? Would you sort of do you see these organizations and networks? Could you explain them using social movement theory, do you think? Or is that something else still?
I would say that they are social movements. Interestingly, in Kenya, they would say that they are part of civil society, right? So like they would be speaking as being CSOs, like all these jargons of how people introduce themselves. But definitely, I think this would be social movement.
Yeah, but that's interesting. That's in a context of high aid. We talk about civil society organizations. Well, elsewhere in Britain you would talk about charities or I don't know, or associations. That's probably depending on the context. Very interesting. Are there any further questions? Do type your questions, people. There's still 5 minutes left. Fraser is one of our third-year students in international development. Thank you so much, Eglė. Do you see sex workers in Kenya organizing around developmental discourses of empowerment? If so, do you see the commodification of sex more broadly as an effective strategy for emancipating people from the system of gender? Very good question, Fraser.
Very good. So empowerment is definitely there. So and I think that this is part of a story of people being engaged with the aid sector and with this international sphere and borrowing heavily from their vocabulary. So empowerment would definitely be part of the conversation, both at the, national KESWA level discourse, but also on a smaller organizations that would be telling me about their empowerment activities, and that can mean anything in different places. Like I really, don't think that there is one thing that sex workers view as empowerment, because in different places it can mean very different things. So for some people, having their kids at school and school fees paid would be empowerment. And in other places, the discussion would be about the need for sex workers to move to the tech sector and digital sector to take advantage of the new opportunities, right? So this empowerment is an interesting word, and I think that it is interesting how different parts of the movement or how different women are using it in entirely different contexts and can refer to almost anything at all. But then the second question about commodification of sex as an effective strategy for emancipation, this is a tough one, right? So yes, there are a lot of examples of people managing to make the most out of through this work. So if we are thinking about colonial Nairobi, we see that a lot of women, they bought a lot of properties, they became the first urban inhabitants. And even today, we see a lot of sex workers who accumulate impressive amounts of money and move into different businesses. And, we can think about them as being empowered. Yet at the same time, this is also the job, the work that leaves a lot of people behind. So in order to be successful, in order to empower yourself, you have to internalize a lot of, neoliberal logics. You have to go alone, you have to be super savvy, you have to be very mobile, you have to pay attention on how you look, what you say, how you approach people, and all those different kind of things. And not everyone is capable of this, neoliberal self-managing of the self, the body, and the work in the same way. And for people who do not manage to, internalize the gendered norms, for example, or who do not manage to see what is the most profitable strategy at a given night in a given locale, they definitely do not get empowered. So we will have a lot of people who, for example, struggle to leave sex work, or who leave sex work in worse position than they were before. So I don't think that there is one answer here. I think that for some people, definitely sex work can be an effective strategy to insert themselves in a society in a more advantageous position. But that is definitely not the story for all of them. And there is a lot of people who, who start struggling with drug addiction, with alcohol addiction, who do not manage to control the money, who contract diseases. And then, that is very easy to push people into the downward spiral where they might be forced to leave sex work in the ways that are much worse than where they were at the beginning of their story. So that would be my answer here.
Yeah, okay. Thank you so much, Eglė. That was so very, very interesting. Sophie, to answer your question about paperback now, if I remember well with how this goes, it means that you and I need to order the hardback for the library and ask all our friends at different universities to buy the book for the library until enough hardbacks are sold for it to go to paperback. So let's do that, and we'll tweet a little bit and try to get the hardback sold so that we can get it in paperback for ourselves. That's the strategy.
I think it might have been somewhere in a contract, but I don't remember. Maybe it is in 2 years, so maybe it is coming out not this December, but next December.
That would be, if it's actually, sometimes it is indeed just a question of time, and in some cases it's a question of selling enough of the hardbacks. Either way, it's a plan for us to order it for the library, because that's always a good start. Thank you so much, Eglė, for your fantastic presentation, and audience for fantastic questions and answer session. So that's great. I'm afraid we'll have to leave it, and as this is Zoom, then that's just sort of, that's it and bye, which is very odd, but there you go. It's the new world.
Thank you very much for having me, and thank you everyone for listening. Happy to be more in touch on the emails if you want. Here you go, 2020 communications.
That's great. Thank you so much. Okay, so we'll leave it at there and see you at the next time and the next event. Everyone, Eglė, goodbye.
Goodbye.
Goodbye. Goodbye. Bye, Sophie, Fraser.